The forest had a smell. Not the clean, earthy scent of pine and damp soil I remembered from hunting trips back in Pennsylvania as a boy. No, the Hürtgen had a different stench. It was a thick, greasy odor of rot. Rotting pine needles, rotting leaves, rotting sandbags, and the sweet, cloying rot of men. It clung to the inside of your nostrils and coated the back of your throat, a constant reminder of where you were. The place the army called the Green Hell. We just called it the meat grinder. For 3 weeks, my world had been reduced to a 100-yard stretch of shattered fir trees, shell craters filled with brackish, rust-colored water, and the perpetual, soul-crushing drip, drip, drip of rain filtering through the canopy. The sky was a myth, a gray, hazy memory above the interlocking branches that clawed at the clouds. Light didn't shine here, it seeped. Sound didn't travel, it was smothered by the dense woods, making every snapped twig sound like a rifle shot, and every rifle shot sound like it was right beside your ear. My name is Sergeant William Davis. The men just call me Sarge. They used to call me other things, back when I had more light in my eyes and fewer ghosts on my shoulders. Now, Sarge was enough. It wasn't a name, it was a title, a job description. And my job was to keep the heart and soul of 3rd Platoon, Baker Company, beating. What was left of it, anyway? There were only 12 of us now, huddled in a series of waterlogged foxholes that we'd inherited from the squad we replaced. Or rather, the squad that had been erased from this particular patch of mud. We were the veterans. The survivors. Men like Corporal Kowalski, a giant from a Chicago slaughterhouse we called Brooklyn for the sheer irony of it. He'd never been east of the Mississippi. He was my rock, my unofficial second-in-command, a man who could chew through German machine gun belts and spit out scrap metal. Then there was Doc Jensen, our medic, a former veterinary student from Iowa whose hands were as steady patching up a sucking chest wound as they were delivering a calf. His eyes held the 2,000-yard stare they talk about in the magazines, a look that saw straight through you and into the next world. And Tex, a wiry little ranch hand who could spot a field mouse twitching at 50 yards and was the only man I knew who actually enjoyed eating K-rations. We were a family, of sorts. A dysfunctional, grime-covered, perpetually terrified family, bound together by the shared trauma of survival. Every man knew his job. Every man knew the man next to him. We moved without speaking, communicated with hand signals and glances, our senses honed to a razor's edge by the constant threat of death. We were a well-oiled, if dented and rusting, machine. And then they sent us the new part, the one that didn't fit. He arrived with the morning supply mule, a walking specter of everything we weren't. His uniform, a fresh set of olive drabs, was clean. So clean it looked like it was glowing in the gloom of the forest. The crease in his trousers was still sharp. His boots weren't caked in months of mud. They had a dull shine. He stood there blinking in the half-light, his M1 Garand held awkwardly across his chest like a toy, a replacement helmet perched on his head, the chin strap hanging loose. He was a child. 18, maybe 19 at a stretch. His face was pale, unlined, his eyes wide and darting, trying to take in the landscape of ruin around him. He looked like a Boy Scout who'd taken a horrifically wrong turn on his way to a jamboree. "Sergeant Davis?" he asked, his voice cracking on the last syllable. It was too loud, a breach of the unwritten law of the forest. You don't make a sound unless you have to. I climbed out of my hole, the cold mud sucking at my boots. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked him up and down, letting the silence hang in the air. Let him feel the weight of our eyes on him. Brooklyn leaned on his shovel, his face a mask of weary disgust. Tex spat a stream of tobacco juice near the kid's immaculate boot. "Name?" I finally grunted. "Private Richard Miller, Sergeant," he said, trying to stand up straighter. "You the replacement?" "Yes, Sergeant." I walked a slow circle around him, like a wolf inspecting a lamb that had wandered into its den. His gear was a disaster. His canteen wasn't secured. It bounced against his hip with a sloshing sound. His bayonet was hanging at the wrong angle. His ammunition belt was too loose. He was a walking noise complaint, a mobile dinner bell for every German sniper in a 5-mile radius. "Where you from, Miller?" "Detroit, Sergeant. Worked in a factory. Chrysler. On the line for the Sherman tanks." A murmur of dark amusement went through the men. A grease monkey, a factory boy from the city. We were hunters, farmers, construction workers, men of the earth. What good was a city kid who built tanks in the middle of this godforsaken forest? He couldn't have been more out of place if he'd been wearing a tuxedo. A tank factory, huh? I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Well, you ain't in Detroit anymore, Miller. There are no assembly lines here. Just the one that takes boys like you and turns them into corpses. You understand me? Yes, Sergeant, he whispered, his face paling even further. Good. First lesson, shut your mouth unless you're shot. Second lesson, do exactly what I say when I say it. Third lesson, try not to get yourself, or any of my men, killed. Now get your gear sorted. You're making enough noise to wake up the whole damn Wehrmacht. I pointed to a half-dug depression near the edge of our small perimeter. That's your new home. Make it deeper. The crowds like to drop mail on us around lunchtime. He just nodded, his eyes wide with fear, and stumbled off towards the hole. I watched him go, a knot of cold anger tightening in my stomach. They were sending us children now. Fresh-faced, clueless children. They trained them for a few months, taught them how to shoot at a stationary target, and then shipped them over to us as replacements. They weren't replacing the men we'd lost. They were just filling a slot on a roster. A body to stop a bullet that might otherwise hit a real soldier. He wasn't a soldier. He was a liability. He was a burden. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that he was going to get someone killed. The first test came sooner than I expected. Not from the Germans, but from our own artillery. A short round. It was a sound you got to know intimately. Not the distant crump of outgoing mail, or the whistling shriek of incoming that gave you a second or two to pray. This was a sudden, violent tearing of the air directly overhead, an ear-splitting crack that felt like the sky itself was ripping in half. Incoming, I roared, diving headfirst back into my foxhole, the mud embracing me like a cold, wet lover. Around me, the veterans vanished. They didn't jump or run. They simply ceased to exist on the surface, melting back into the earth that was both their sanctuary and their potential grave. The world erupted in a cataclysm of noise and violence. The ground bucked like a living thing. Dirt, pine needles, and hot, jagged shards of steel rained down through the trees, shredding leaves and branches. The air was thick with the smell of cordite. When the immediate hellfire passed, replaced by the ringing in my ears and the patter of falling debris, I cautiously raised my head. Brooklyn was already up, shaking dirt from his collar. Tex was peering through a pair of binoculars. I did a quick head count. Everyone was down. Everyone except one. Miller. He was standing right out in the open, exactly where he'd been trying to dig. He was frozen solid, a statue of terror. His eyes were wide and blank, his mouth hung open, and his knuckles were white where he gripped his shovel. He hadn't moved an inch. He had just stood there, paralyzed, while death rained down around him. A cold fury, colder than the mud, washed over me. I scrambled out of my hole, ignoring the shouts of the other men. I ran to him, my feet sinking in the soft earth, and tackled him hard, driving him down into the shallow pit he'd been digging. We landed in a heap, his useless shovel clattering beside us. I grabbed the front of his jacket, hauling his face close to mine. His eyes were unfocused, staring at nothing. He was in shock. Miller. I shook him hard. Snap out of it. You want to die? Is that what they sent you here for? To be a scarecrow for the crowd artillery? His eyes slowly came back into focus. He stared at me, trembling like a leaf in a storm. He couldn't speak. He just shivered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. I shoved him away from me in disgust and stood up, brushing the mud from my pants. Get this hole dug, I snarled. The next time that happens, I'm not saving your ass. If you can't even find a hole to jump in, you're better off dead. I walked back to my position, the veterans pointedly looking away, giving me space. They knew the look on my face. They'd seen it before. It was the look I got when I knew a man was marked. Miller wasn't just green. He was a hazard. A walking, talking, frozen-in-fear accident waiting to happen. The rest of the day was a series of small, infuriating proofs of his incompetence. He asked Doc where he could wash his socks, as if we had a goddamn laundry service. Doc just stared at him with those hollow eyes until Miller finally slunk away. He struggled for an hour with the hard, root-choked ground, his shovel making pathetic scraping noises. Brooklyn eventually took pity on him, and with 3 powerful heaves of his own entrenching tool, did more in 30 seconds than Miller had done all morning. The kid just stood there, humiliated, clutching his own shovel like an idiot. Later, a lone German patrol probed our lines. It was nothing serious, just a few shadows flitting between the trees to see if we were still awake. We held our fire, letting them get closer. It was a game of nerves. The first man to shoot gives away the whole position. We were patient. We were professionals. And then Miller's rifle went off. It wasn't a single, aimed shot. It was the entire 8-round clip, fired as fast as he could pull the trigger. Bang, 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 ping. The final, distinctive ping of the ejected en-bloc clip echoed through the silent forest with damning clarity. He had emptied his Garand at nothing. A shadow. A sound. A ghost conjured by his own fear. The German patrol, their presence now confirmed, fired a few unaimed bursts in our direction and melted back into the woods. The chance for an ambush was gone. Our position was broadcast to every German in the sector, all because the new kid couldn't keep his finger off the trigger. I crawled over to his hole. He was fumbling with a new clip, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit it into the rifle. What in the goddamn hell was that, Miller? I whispered, my voice a low, dangerous hiss. Did you see something? I thought I saw one of them, Sarge, he stammered. Over by that fallen log. You thought? I spat. You thought? We don't think out here, son. We know. You don't fire unless you have a target. You don't fire unless I give the order. You just pissed away 8 rounds of ammunition and told the entire German army exactly where we are, all because you thought you saw something. You're a goddamn menace. Just then, a single shot cracked through the woods. It wasn't the heavy report of a Kar 98K. It was sharper, flatter. A sniper. The bullet thwacked into the dirt mound a few inches from Miller's head, sending a spray of mud into his face. He yelped and tried to stand up in a blind panic. Before he could get his head above the edge of the foxhole, I grabbed him by the collar and yanked him down so hard his helmet clanked against the stock of his rifle. Stay down. I roared in a whisper. He's got you zeroed. You move an inch, and he'll take your damn head off. I held him there, his body trembling against my arm. I could feel his heart hammering like a drum. I peered over the edge of the parapet, scanning the trees. A sniper was the last thing we needed. They were ghosts. You never saw them. You only saw what they did. Tex, I called out in a low voice. You see him? Nothing, Sarge, came the quiet reply from a few yards away. He's dug in deep. We were pinned. For the next hour, we lay there, pressed into the mud, as the sniper played with us. Every time someone shifted, a single, terrifying shot would crack past, a reminder that he was out there, watching, waiting. Miller just lay at the bottom of his foxhole, making small, whimpering sounds. He was useless. Worse than useless. His panic was infectious, a disease that could spread through the platoon and get us all killed. When the sniper finally got bored and moved on, the tension slowly eased. I crawled back to my position, my mind made up. The kid was a cancer. He couldn't fight, he couldn't follow orders, and he couldn't control his fear. That evening, as we choked down cold rations, he made one last, pathetic attempt to be one of us. He crawled over to where Brooklyn and I were sitting, sharing a cigarette. He was holding a worn photograph. This is my girl, Beth, he said, his voice barely a whisper, offering the picture to us. And that's my kid brother, Timmy. Brooklyn just grunted and turned his back. I didn't even look at the picture. Nobody cares about your girl, Miller, I said, my voice flat and cold. The men in this platoon, they're all you've got. And right now, you're doing a piss-poor job of making them want to keep you around. Get back to your hole. He flinched as if I'd struck him. He pulled the photo back, his face crumbling. He crawled away without another word. I saw him a few minutes later, curled up in his foxhole, staring at the picture, his shoulders shaking, reading a letter from home. It was a sight that filled me with a weary, bitter contempt. Love letters and family photos were anchors. They were weights that dragged you down, reminded you of a world you couldn't have, a life you'd probably never get back to. They made you weak. Out here, you couldn't afford to be weak. You had to cut those ties. You had to be empty. You had to be hard. This kid wasn't hard. He was a bundle of exposed nerves, raw fear, and homesick sentiment. He was a burden, a weight we couldn't afford to carry. And as the cold night settled over the Hürtgen, a dark, ugly idea began to form in my mind. An idea of how to get rid of that weight. Permanently. It wasn't a nice thought, but this wasn't a nice war. In the meat grinder, you did what you had to do to survive. And I would survive. My men would survive. Even if it meant cutting one part of the platoon loose to save the rest. The order came down the next morning, carried by a runner who looked as tired and miserable as we did. It was another brilliant plan cooked up by some officer in a clean tent miles from the front. They had a map, and on that map was a crossroads designated Objective Sparrow. According to their intelligence, it was a key supply junction for the Germans in this sector. Our company was to take it. Our platoon was to spearhead the assault. A suicide mission, gift-wrapped in official language. The lieutenant, a fresh-faced West Pointer named Foley who still believed the things he read in field manuals, called me over to his command post, a slightly bigger hole covered with a poncho. He spread the map out on an ammo crate, his finger tracing the route. "Here's the plan, Sergeant," he said, his voice full of a confidence he hadn't earned. "We advance up this draw here." He pointed a manicured finger at a depression on the map and hit the crossroads from the south. "The key is speed and surprise. We hit them hard and fast before they can dig in." I stared at the map. It was a piece of paper that bore little resemblance to the hellish terrain outside. The draw was a muddy, corpse-strewn creek bed. The woods on either side were a sniper's paradise. It was a textbook ambush alley. "With all due respect, sir," I said, keeping my voice level, "that's a kill box. The Krauts will have machine guns zeroed in on that draw from both sides. They'll slaughter us before we get halfway." Foley's jaw tightened. He didn't like being questioned. "That's a risk we'll have to take, Sergeant. The element of surprise is paramount." "Sir, there's no such thing as surprise in this forest. They hear us coming from a mile away." "Your concerns are noted," he said, his tone final. "The attack is at 0800. Get your men ready." I walked back to my squad, the anger simmering in my gut. Hard and fast. Idiots. The only thing hard and fast in the Hürtgen was the way you died. I gathered the men, my real men, and relayed the plan. I saw the look in their eyes. They knew what it was. Brooklyn just shook his head slowly. Tex worked his tobacco, his eyes narrowed. Doc checked his morphine syrettes, his face grim. And then I looked over at Miller. He was watching us, his face a mask of anxious ignorance. He was trying to look like a soldier, but he just looked like a lost child waiting for the grown-ups to tell him what to do. And in that moment, the ugly idea from the night before crystallized into a cold, hard plan. I couldn't save the whole squad from Foley's folly, but I could remove the weakest link. The variable that was most likely to get us all killed when the shooting started. I walked over to him. He scrambled to his feet, trying to stand at attention. "Miller," I said, my voice deliberately flat. "I've got a special assignment for you." Hope flickered in his eyes. The poor fool thought he was being singled out for something important. I pointed to a long, exposed ridge that ran parallel to our planned route of attack, but a good 500 yards to the east. It was a barren, shattered spine of rock and dead trees, a place no sane soldier would go. "See that ridge?" I said. "Command wants eyes up there. An observation post. You're going to take this field phone." I pointed to the heavy SCR 300 radio sitting by my foxhole, but then stopped myself. No, a radio was too valuable. A field phone was better. It was disposable. You're going to take a field phone and a spool of commo wire. You're going to crawl up to the top of that ridge, find a spot with a good view of the valley beyond, and you're going to report whatever you see. Understood? He looked at the ridge, then back at me. Even he, in his boundless naivety, could see it was a suicide spot. "Alone, Sergeant?" "You're a scout, Miller. Scouts work alone. It's a vital mission. You'll be our eyes and ears on the eastern flank. Protect the whole company." I laid the lie on thick. Let him die thinking he was a hero. The other men were watching now. I saw the understanding dawn on their faces. Brooklyn looked down at the ground, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Doc Jensen's face was unreadable, but he knew. They all knew. It was a death sentence. A time-honored tradition of sending the useless guy on a mission he'd never come back from. They didn't like it, but they understood the brutal calculus of survival. His life, weighed against ours. Miller, bless his stupid, trusting heart, swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, Sergeant. Take a full spool of wire, a spare battery for the phone, and 3K rations. Travel light. Stay low. And don't move from that spot until you're relieved." Which would be never. I watched him as he gathered the gear, his hands trembling slightly. The heavy phone, the clumsy A-frame pack for the wire spool. He looked like a turtle getting ready for a race it was doomed to lose. He adjusted his helmet, checked his garand, and then looked back at the squad. He wanted to say something. A goodbye? A good luck. But the wall of cold silence from the other men was absolute. They wouldn't meet his eyes. They were already treating him like a ghost. He turned to me. I won't let you down, Sergeant. See that you don't. I grunted, turning my back on him. I couldn't look at him anymore. And Miller, I called over my shoulder, the final, cruel twist of the knife. Don't call in unless you see a full-blown Panzer division rolling through. We don't need to be bothered with the little stuff. I heard him stumble away, the commo wire unreeling behind him with a soft, rustling sound. I listened until the sound was gone, swallowed by the forest. I didn't watch him go. I didn't expect to ever see him again. In my mind, he was already dead. A necessary sacrifice. A heavy silence settled over the squad. Finally, Brooklyn came over to me, his voice low. Sarge, that was cold. War is cold, Corporal, I said, my voice harder than I intended. That kid would have frozen in the first firefight. He would have gotten you killed. Or me. Or Texas. This way. This way he's out of the way. Maybe he'll even get lucky, and a sniper will make it quick. It's better than watching him die screaming in that creek bed. It was a lie, I told myself. A justification for sending a boy to his death. I wasn't saving him from anything. I was just getting rid of a problem. I pushed the thought away. There was no time for a conscience. All right. I barked, turning to the rest of the men, my voice all business now. Forget about him. Let's talk about the real plan. Foley wants us to go up that draw like lambs to the slaughter. We're not doing it. We're going to parallel it, stay in the trees to the west. We'll be slower, but we'll have cover. Tex, you're on point. Brooklyn, you and your bar team provide covering fire. We move in bounds. 20-yard rushes, no more. And for God's sake, stay quiet. They nodded, the relief on their faces palpable. This was a plan that made sense. A plan for survival. We were ignoring the LT's orders, but the LT wasn't the one who had to crawl through the mud. His orders would get us medals, posthumously. My orders would get us through the day. As we moved out, heading in the opposite direction from the ridge where Miller was crawling towards his lonely death, I allowed myself a final thought about the kid. Maybe this was a mercy. The forest chewed up idealists and spat out bone fragments. It broke the strong and shattered the brave. What chance did a soft, scared kid from Detroit have? None. By sending him away, I had simply expedited the inevitable. I was a sergeant. I made hard decisions. This was just another one. I put him out of my mind. He was no longer my problem. He was a ghost, and the living had a war to fight. The initial push went better than I had any right to expect. We moved like phantoms through the shattered tree line, keeping the muddy creek bed, Foley's designated draw, on our left. Every few minutes, we'd freeze, listening to the drip of the water and the groaning of the trees. The air was thick with a tense, unnatural silence. The Germans knew we were coming. They were just waiting, letting us walk deeper into the jaws of the trap. We found the first line of their defenses abandoned. A shallow trench, littered with empty ration tins and spent rifle casings. A good sign, maybe, or a very, very bad one. They've pulled back, Brooklyn whispered, his knuckles white around the grip of his bar. They're drawing us in. I know, I breathed back. Keep your eyes peeled. Our support, a lone Sherman tank we called Lucy, lumbered behind us, its tracks churning the mud into a thick porridge. Its presence was both a comfort and a liability. It was a big, loud target, but its 75mm cannon was the only real answer we had to a fortified German bunker. We advanced another 50 yards, the supposed objective, the crossroads, just visible through a break in the trees. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet. My skin crawled. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This was wrong. All of it. Then, hell opened its gates. It started with a sound that every veteran on the Western Front knew and feared. It wasn't the slow thump-thump-thump of an American .30 caliber. It was a frantic, high-pitched ripping noise, like a giant tearing a sheet of canvas in two. BRRRRRRT. The MG-42. Hitler's buzzsaw. It opened up from a concrete pillbox on our right flank, a position we hadn't seen, perfectly concealed by a thicket of firs. A stream of tracers, impossibly fast, cut through the air over our heads, shredding branches and turning the tree trunks around us into splintered wood. Down! I screamed. A useless command as every man was already kissing the mud. Almost immediately, a second MG-42 opened up from the left, across the draw. We were caught, pinned in a perfect crossfire. The air was thick with flying lead, a hornet's nest of supersonic death. Foley's draw would have been a slaughterhouse. My route was only marginally better. We were trapped. The crew of Lucy reacted fast. The turret began to traverse towards the right-hand pillbox. But they never got the chance to fire. There was a loud whoosh from the woods ahead, and a streak of fire and smoke shot out, impacting the Sherman's side armor with a deafening clang. A Panzerfaust. The shaped charge didn't penetrate the thickest part of the hull, but it didn't have to. It blew one of the tracks clean off. The tank lurched to a halt, crippled. Another whoosh. This one hit the turret. The explosion was immense. The commander's hatch blew 100 feet into the air, and a jet of orange flame erupted from the opening. The tank was dead, a burning steel coffin. The smell of diesel, cordite, and cooked flesh rolled over us. Now they had us. With the tank gone, there was nothing to stop them. Mortar shells began to rain down, the explosions walking their way up and down our pathetic line. Crump, crump, whump. The ground shook, and shrapnel whizzed through the air like angry bees. I heard a scream, cut short. It was Ramirez, one of our riflemen. "Doc!" I yelled. I saw Jensen low-crawling towards the scream, his bag of tricks in hand. The machine gun fire was relentless. They had our range, our position, everything. They were just playing with us now, cutting us to pieces one man at a time. The radio on my back suddenly went dead as a piece of shrapnel tore through it, smashing the vacuum tubes and ruining our only link to the outside world. We were alone, completely and utterly cut off. My mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. There was none. We couldn't go forward. We couldn't go back. To our left was the open draw, swept by machine gun fire. To our right was the pillbox that had started it all. We were pinned, bleeding, and dying in a muddy, anonymous patch of German forest. The Germans, sensing victory, started to press their advantage. Gray uniformed figures began moving in the woods in front of us, firing their Kar 98K rifles, their silhouettes ghost-like in the smoke and mist. They were methodical, professional, tightening the noose. From the pillbox, I heard the distinctive thump of a grenade launcher, and seconds later, a potato masher grenade landed just behind Brooklyn's position, showering him with mud and splinters. "Sarge, they're flanking us," Tex yelled, firing his Garand at the moving shapes. Bang, bang, ping. I saw the look in his eyes. In Brooklyn's eyes. It was a look I had seen too many times. The fatalistic acceptance of the end. The fight was draining out of them, being replaced by a weary resignation. We had fought hard. We had survived so much, only to die here, for a meaningless crossroads on a useless map. I crawled over to Brooklyn, the bullets snapping over my head. "We have to break out." I yelled over the din, "Back the way we came. Lay down suppressing fire on that right flank pillbox. I'll throw smoke." It was a desperate, stupid plan, but it was the only one I had. Brooklyn nodded grimly, repositioning his bar. I pulled the pins on my 2 smoke grenades, ready to give us the few seconds of cover we would need. This is it, I thought. This is the end of the line. And in that moment of absolute despair, I didn't even remember the kid I had sent to die on the ridge. Miller was a ghost, a forgotten footnote in a story that was about to come to a bloody, final conclusion. I had sent him away to save us, and it hadn't made a damn bit of difference. We were all going to die anyway. The German noose grew tighter. Their infantry was closer now, maybe 50 yards out, darting between the trees with a practiced ease that made my stomach clench. They were veterans. They smelled blood. The 2 MG-42s kept up their relentless, overlapping fire, pinning us so tightly to the earth that to raise your head an inch was to invite decapitation. Doc was screaming that he was out of bandages. Tex was down to his last clip. It was over. We were just counting down the seconds. Their assault team was bunching up behind a large, fallen oak, getting ready for the final rush that would overrun our position and finish us with bayonets and grenades. I could see the officer, a man in a sharp cap, waving his men forward. I raised my Garand, took a breath, and prepared to take him with me. And then something impossible happened. The German officer, in the middle of shouting a command, suddenly stiffened. His cap flew from his head. He stood there for a second, a perfect, round hole appearing in the center of his forehead, before collapsing like a puppet with its strings cut. From somewhere deep in the woods, far behind the German lines, came a single, clear, unmistakable sound. Ping. The M1 Garand. The Germans around the fallen officer stopped dead, confusion turning to panic. They started yelling, looking around, trying to figure out where the shot had come from. It hadn't come from us. It had come from their rear. Before they could recover, the primary MG-42 nest, the concrete pillbox that had been tearing us to shreds, erupted in a flash of orange and a cloud of black smoke. A grenade. A perfectly thrown American pineapple grenade, right through the firing slit. The devastating BRRRRRT of the machine gun was replaced by a sudden, shocking silence. My men and I just stared, dumbfounded. Brooklyn looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Sarge, what in the hell?" I had no answer. It was like an angel had descended into the green hell. The Germans were now in chaos. They were no longer attacking us. They were firing wildly into the forest behind them, at the unseen enemy who was taking them apart. They were caught in their own trap. Then, a German supply truck, a big Opel Blitz that had been parked behind their lines, exploded in a massive fireball. A satchel charge, maybe? The blast sent a shockwave through the trees and showered their position with burning debris. The secondary explosions of the ammunition it was carrying were like a string of firecrackers. It was a miracle. A goddamn, bona fide miracle. And I wasn't about to waste it. "Pour it on him!" I roared, a surge of adrenaline washing away my despair. They're on the run. Hope, fierce and desperate, ignited my squad. Brooklyn opened up with his bar, scything through the disorganized German infantry. Tex, his fear forgotten, began calmly picking off targets with his Garand. We, who had been seconds from annihilation, were now on the attack. The Germans broke. Caught between our renewed fire and the terrifying, unseen ghost in their rear, they folded completely. They abandoned their positions, dragging their wounded with them, and melted back into the dark woods from whence they came. The battle, which had raged for what felt like an eternity, was over in less than 2 minutes. The sudden silence was more deafening than the gunfire. All I could hear was the ringing in my ears, the crackle of the burning truck, and the ragged, gasping breaths of my men. We were alive. Battered, bleeding, but alive. I crawled over to the smashed remains of my radio, my mind reeling. Who was it? Where did they come from? Was it another platoon from Charlie Company, sent on a wide flanking maneuver? It had to be. But why hadn't the LT told us? "What was that, Sarge?" Tex asked, his voice full of awe. "Artillery." "That was no artillery, son," I said, shaking my head. "That first shot. That was a Garand. One man. And that grenade toss. That was a work of art." We cautiously secured the area, checking the German foxholes. They were gone. It was like they had vanished. But the chaos they'd left behind was real. The dead officer, the silent pillbox, the burning truck. One man had done this. A ghost in the woods. He had single-handedly broken a prepared German ambush and saved our lives. For the next hour, we tended to our wounded and waited, rifles at the ready, expecting the ghost to emerge from the woods and make contact. But there was nothing. Just the dripping of the trees and the groan of cooling metal from the destroyed truck. The forest had swallowed our savior as completely as it had swallowed the Germans. I didn't understand it, but I was grateful. Whoever he was, he had given us a chance. A chance to live another day. A chance to die some other time, in some other muddy hole. As I sat there, cleaning my rifle with a shaking hand, the thought of the kid, Miller, was the furthest thing from my mind. He was a bad memory, a problem I had solved in the coldest way possible. The ghost in the woods was a professional, a hardened killer, a fellow veteran. He was nothing like the terrified, useless boy I had sent off to die. The miracle was short-lived. The ghost had bought us a reprieve, not a victory. The woods were still crawling with Germans, and we were still cut off, wounded, and low on ammunition. The silence that followed their retreat was heavy with menace. They weren't gone, they were regrouping. And they would be back, this time with something bigger. My premonition proved right. It started with a low rumble that wasn't thunder. A deep, guttural vibration that I felt in my teeth and in the soles of my boots. It was a sound that made the birds go silent and the blood run cold. It was the sound of heavy armor on the move. "Panther," Brooklyn breathed, his face pale under the grime. I know that sound. We all knew it. The distinctive, grinding growl of a Maybach engine. It was the apex predator of the European theater. Thicker armor, a longer, more powerful 75mm gun. It made our destroyed Sherman look like a toy. It emerged from the trees to our right, a monster of steel and shadow. It was bigger than I remembered, a moving mountain of sloping armor painted in a mottled camouflage of green and brown that made it a part of the forest. It crushed saplings under its wide tracks as if they were matchsticks. The long barrel of its main gun swiveled slowly, searching, an unblinking eye of death. This was it, the real end. We had no bazooka, no anti-tank grenades. Our rifles and machine guns would just bounce off its hide. There was nothing we could do but watch it come. The Panther ignored the burning truck and the abandoned German positions. Its commander knew exactly where we were. It lumbered forward, turning slightly, its cannon aligning directly on the cluster of foxholes where I lay with Brooklyn and a wounded Texas. The massive turret stopped moving. The gunner was taking aim. I closed my eyes, a bitter, final prayer on my lips. Suddenly, a muffled thump came from behind the tank. It wasn't the massive report of the main gun. It was a dull, contained explosion. The Panther shuddered. A thick plume of greasy, black smoke belched from the large circular engine grills on its rear deck. The menacing growl of the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The great steel beast fell silent, immobilized. The long cannon, aimed right at my heart, drooped a few inches, suddenly impotent. My eyes snapped open. What had happened? A mine? And then I saw him. Rising from a muddy ditch not 10 feet from the Panther's rear was a figure. A lone American soldier, covered head to toe in mud and filth. He was holding an empty canvas satchel. He tossed it aside, raised his M1 Garand to his shoulder with a fluid motion that was anything but clumsy, and fired. Bang ping. One of the German tank crewmen, trying to bail out of the commander's hatch, fell back inside. The soldier then turned his attention to the second MG-42 nest, the one that had been suppressed but not destroyed. It was coming back to life. Before the German gunner could get off a burst, the soldier fired 3 times. Bang, bang, bang. Methodical, precise. The machine gun fell silent for good. He stood there for a moment, surveying the battlefield he now commanded. Then, he started walking towards us. His movements were no longer hesitant or scared. They were deliberate, economical. The walk of a hunter. It was Miller. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. It couldn't be him. The clumsy, terrified kid from Detroit? The boy who froze under artillery and wasted a full clip on a shadow? It wasn't possible. But it was him. His face was caked in mud, scratched and bleeding, but it was him. The only thing different was his eyes. The wide-eyed fear was gone. In its place was a look I recognized. It was the 2,000-yard stare. The look of a man who has been to hell and is no longer afraid of the fire. He trudged over to our line, the surviving members of the squad just staring at him, their mouths agape. He stepped over the lip of my foxhole and stood before me, his Garand held expertly at the ready. He was no longer a clean, scared boy in a fresh uniform. He was a warrior, baptized in mud and cordite. He looked at me, his gaze steady. He gave a simple, factual report, as if he were commenting on the weather. "Ridge is clear, Sergeant," he said, his voice low and steady. All the boyishness burned out of it. "Ran into some trouble on the way. A machine gun nest. An observation post. Took care of it. Saw their attack forming up, so I came down. The phone wire broke, so I couldn't call. I took care of that, too." He gestured with his chin towards the chaos he had wrought. The dead German officer. The silent pillboxes. The burning truck. The crippled Panther tank. It was the most profound understatement I had ever heard. The tank. I managed to croak, my throat dry. How? He looked at the dead Panther, a flicker of his old self, the Detroit grease monkey, appearing for a second. "The engine's air intake is on the rear deck, Sergeant. Just like on a Sherman. It's a design flaw. You get a 3-pound satchel charge right on top of that grill, it sucks the blast straight into the engine block. Cracks the whole thing. They taught us that at the Chrysler plant, in case of saboteurs." He had used his knowledge. Not as a soldier, but as a mechanic. He hadn't just gotten lucky. He had seen a problem, diagnosed it, and applied a technical solution with a block of TNT. It was brilliant. It was insane. And it had saved all our lives. The veterans, Brooklyn, Tex, The others were looking at him now with something that bordered on religious awe. He was no longer the greenhorn, the burden. He was the ghost. He was the hero. I looked up at him, this boy I had sent to die. This child who had refused to be a sacrifice and had instead become our savior. There were no words. Thank you was too small. Good job was an insult. The army, the war, we didn't have a vocabulary for what he had done. So I did the only thing I could. I looked him straight in his new, old eyes. And I gave him a single, sharp, deliberate nod. It was enough. A flicker of understanding passed between us. He nodded back, a mirror image of my own gesture. The war had taken the boy from him, and in his place, it had forged a soldier. Later that night, after another platoon finally broke through to relieve us, we sat around a small, smokeless fire, the 10 of us who were left. There was no celebration. We were too tired, too numb. Miller was sitting slightly apart, cleaning his rifle with meticulous care. I pulled my flask from my jacket. It was my last one, filled with cheap, burning whiskey I had been saving. I took a small sip, then I walked over to him. I didn't say a word. I just held out the flask. He stopped cleaning his rifle and looked up at me. He looked at the flask, then back at my face. He slowly reached out and took it. He unscrewed the cap, wiped the lip with his sleeve, and took a long, slow drink. He coughed once, the raw alcohol hitting his system, then screwed the cap back on and handed it back to me. He was one of us now. The burden had paid his dues in blood and fire. And in the quiet understanding of that shared drink, a new bond was forged in the unending darkness of the Hürtgen Forest.